I think he's pretty well recognized. Of course, we wish that it would be even more so, but I think he's pretty well known. Imagine what he would have written in the 40 years since he died, because he did quite a bit.
My impression is that my father was starting to be more prominent in the few years right before his death. He traveled more to universities, colleges for readings, and I think that's probably a sign of some greater interest in his poems. I don't think much of anybody ever bought the books, but that's probably true for every poet from that era except maybe Robert Frost.
Well, all poets by definition are neglected because the American public simply does not cherish poetry as it should. But some are less well known than others, and it doesn't matter. They're just as good, and they will be known at one point or another in time.
Well, they all say that about him. I mean, you know, the big shots, they have him among the neglected poets. So that's the term that's being used now.
This is the one called I Am Disquieted When I See Many Hills. I am disquieted when I see many hills, as one who looks down on the backs of tremendous cattle, shoulder to shoulder, munching in silence the grass in a timeless region, where time is not, event and breath are nothing. Yet we who are lost in time, growing and fading in the shadow of majesty, cannot but dumbly yearn for its stronger oblivion. Reject this archaic craving to be a herdsman of the immortals. Until they trample you down, be still a herdsman's boy among these giants and the ridges of laurel.
Coming in? Oh, I left it on. Let's see, now we gotta, who would believe that I would be...
The most interesting things about New Orleans is the number of private gardens here. But the city doesn't reveal its gardens easily. A lot of them are locked away behind Mary Fonseca. She's a garden
Why
book
doesn't
author.
this, oh, there we
go.
go. No, why,
Rarely seen
wait,
by the public. Let's go meet her.
there we go. All right, let's see where we are. Oh, he's awful. I mean, he's a provost. Okay, stop. Yeah, I'd like you to hear Neil. Oh, there he is.
I remember the first time I visited the Plutzik home more than 3 decades ago. And Mrs. Plutzik, as she was then to me, showed me to her husband's study. He went through the kitchen, down a steep flight of stairs.
And he took a bunch of books, too.
Past the pool table. And over in the far corner, this was not a very poetic environment. There was a small makeshift room, very dark,
See?
with a bare light bulb hanging from the ceiling.
Neil.
And the air was slightly damp.
Oh, come on.
And the room was filled with books.
It's a storage room for me now. I'm not showing it because it's not a study now. I do have some books still, but down there. And you can imagine if it was musty, the books would not have survived for 40 some odd years. I can decide what's important. And this is going to be recorded for posterity, right?
Tanya's lived her entire life remembering my brother. And I would guess that she hasn't changed anything. I'll bet you that the library or the office or whatever you call it is probably still the same, because that's the way she wanted it.
Well, my mother's talked about my father a lot, and she has a vision, a view and a vision and a projection of him that she's tried to preserve both with us and to the world, to the extent that the world is interested.
I put this out for your benefit. I thought it was a good thing to put everything out on. Is that okay?
My mother is a family encouraging, unifying force. And partly I think it in some way relates to her, complete embrace of my father's work. This idea that he's alive and his work is alive. There's sort of an energy in the family which doesn't dissipate because she's so into it.
He is over here. And here he is over here.
There's a commitment to an interest in a cause, and basically it's just to make his work present and relevant, to continue to have it be relevant. But it's carried within her obviously differently than others. I mean, there's just no way that the depth or the calling that she feels anybody else feels.
An echo in the mouth of strangers, a statuette in a cold hall, the lesser name of 5 stars, or where hunger, love, and fear from ancestral dens of the skull issue forth like footpads and suddenly cry loud for new tribute and immolation.
I used to be offended when Alan Tate said poets are the custodians of language, because it sounded like someone who kept it locked away and safe and unused and bright as a penny. Yeah. But in fact, poets keep us aware of the full implications of language, this major means by which we comprehend ourselves and the universe and give it shape.
After looking into a book belonging to my great-grandfather, Eli Eliakim Plutzik, I am troubled by the blank fields, the speechless graves. Since the names were carved upon wood, there is no word for the 1,000 years that shaped this scribbling fist and the eyes staring at strange places and times beyond the veldt dragging to Poland. Lovers of words make simple peace with death, at last demanding to close the door to the cold. Only here lies someone, here lie no one and no one. your fathers and mothers?
My brother Alan, this is probably of interest, he's done a tremendous amount of research on the family tree in Russia, and so he knows a lot about my dad's family. That's his latest pursuit.
I've been digging into the family genealogy a good deal, and on my father's side, not my mother's, because for some reason it's been hard to find information about my mother's family, but I found quite a bit about where my father's family came from. They came from a small town in what's now Belarus called Lyapichy. That town had 750 inhabitants. My grandmother said it differently, but I knew what it was because part of her little narration about where she came from would involve, I came from a little tiny village, you probably never heard of it, Lyapich. Most of the residents of Lyapichy were Jewish, and many in Bobrisk were too. It was a relatively prosperous area because everybody was selling things to the army, especially lumber. And in fact, my father's grandfather, Hyam Plutzik, was a lumber merchant. Sometimes I think, well, it really doesn't matter who was in your family. If I can find out a little fragment of something about my great-great-grandfather who lived in this village and he was a cobbler or a tailor or whatever, what difference does it make? Maybe the interest is just a more conventional historical interest in that civilization, in those traditions, in that group of people who were wiped out.
As I watch you light the Shabbos candles, there's a gentle glow across your face while you're standing there, whispering a prayer. None can take your place. Mamala, 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 always call you mamala.
My father was very, very skinny. And in those days, when you were very, very skinny, they thought you had dread diseases like consumption or something. So they told him, you've got to get out of New York and you've got to go somewhere where you have fresh air and you belong on a farm. So they borrowed $500 and they bought a farm. They built up that farm. They were there about 10 years, and they made it into a decent place. Okay, I was born in this house exactly 86 years ago. You got to understand, when we were here on the farm, there was nothing here. In other words, you didn't see anything else. Well, somewhere down there is a stream, but in the passing of years, I don't really know anything. Oh, this is really a very funny thing. In other words, it was your mother that my parents sold the house. They bought it from the Plutziks.
My parents bought it from the Plutziks.
Right.
If you were born here in 1919, and do you know how old the house was? How old the house was?
Yeah, I'll tell you something very funny. My older brother, he went to school. You know that antique shop?
I went to school there.
Okay, that antique shop had 8 grades in one room. So he went all the way through 8 grades here. I had the greatest childhood you could ever imagine. It was the warmest, nicest place, and we never had any money. And yet, when I think back, it was a great childhood. Tell me.
It's closed. She only sees people by appointment.
Yeah.
So you can't get out.
So this is it.
Hyam Plutzik is certainly Jewish, yes, and so am I, yes. Neither of us is an immigrant, of course. His parents were immigrants, though, and Yiddish was his first language. And I think that distinguishes him from many other Jewish poets.
My dad was a humanist. My mother is a humanist. And they were raised in Orthodox Jewish homes, but my understanding is in our home they were not particularly observant. They knew they were Jewish. You know, coming from New York City, that was a Jewish culture there that they grew up in. And I don't think they recognized a need to be all that overt with it. Judaism, though, is or the kind of Judaism that I intuit my dad practiced was less about the dogma, because he was raised in a dogmatic, I don't mean it pejoratively dogmatic, but I mean just with the liturgy and stuff. His dad was a rabbi. I think that he was into asking life's questions, and he didn't go to the temple to go to the services, but he used to go and meet with the education director and just talk about ideas and stuff. He was interested in sort of the philosophical issues.
Every writer craves an ethnic identification. It enriches him or her, and it also tells you who you are in terms of ancestors, in terms of tradition.
Whatever my failings as in keeping the tradition alive, I'm certainly a Jewish person. Every Jewish person has to grapple at some level, consciously or otherwise, with the fact that most of us got wiped out, and that there's a good deal of value in the culture, and that the burden falls on our shoulders somehow to decide how to preserve it or whether to preserve it.
My parents wanted to be Jewish and intensely Jewish and belonged to synagogues and kept the observances, but their sisters and brothers, most of them, tried to blend in, to assimilate. And here is a portrait. He tries to be a Jew casually, to ignore the monster, the mountain, a few thousand years of history. Of course, he personally remembers nothing. It is agreed that he of all men has gained the right to his soul, parenthesis, though like the others, he no longer believes in one. He has left his religion, this Jew.
I'll sing a Jewish song. How's that?
What are you going to sing?
Often Pripyat. Yeah, that's good.
Somewhere, my love.
Often Pripyat grant a fire on each of his haze. On der Rebellerend mit die Kinderlach om Salef Beis. On der Rebellerend
Kinderlach dem Olaf Beis. Seht ihr Kinderlach, gedenkt ihr Teira, was ihr lehren du. Sagt ihr noch einmal, Tage noch einmal, kommet alle vor. Sagt ihr noch einmal und Tage noch einmal, kommet alle vor.
Let's see, I always have trouble opening these things. Okay. Ready?
This poem, I think, is a useful one to illustrate an experience which I know many poets have had. That is, to find themselves giving importance to something that happens to them, some event, and yet not knowing why it's important.
I listened to my husband reading. That's one of the most important pleasures that I have.
The importance of poetry are the coming forth from eternity into time. Beyond the image of the willow, there is a willow no man knows, or watches with corruptible eyes. Deep in a field where no man goes, nor bird flies, the willow fronts an empty road. The bird hovers in other skies, world where only these wings exist, and elsewhere alone upon an abyss, a man is marching down a road. As the rays of the sun are drawn together by a curved glass and rekindled to fire, so to the poppy's life and death, so does desire draw them and bend them and bind them so the noise of the wings can at last be heard, and the willow image do grace to a bird, and the ghost on the roadway give them word, not for forever, only a day.
My mother actually had talked for years about this letter that existed, written by my father to a professor, mentor of his, Odell Shepard at Trinity College. It's about 75 pages long and begins in May of 1941, but really discuss the previous 7 years of his life.
You know, the thing in that letter, my father knew what he wanted to do. He was shaken by, that he was not successful when he was young, and he was poor, but he knew what he wanted to do, and he never changed his mind. He did it.
The few things I have written, managed to put on paper during the fret of trying to earn a living, have not been totally bad. They have not been the sort of thing one reads 3 lines of and then throws away, but there has always been an odd element, some extrusive quality resulting in lack of unity. I think I have not yet developed my powers of selection. Being conscious of the fault, however, I feel and hope that when this is done, I shall have reached the maturity of art to which I aspire, and that I am able to say things, I hope, that will merit the respect of intelligent men.
It seems that among Hyam's colleagues and friends, I go back the longest in time. Actually, it will be 65 years since the fall of 1933 that he and I entered the Yale Graduate School to read for the PhD in English. It turned out that Hyam and I had rooms on the same entry of the graduate school, so that I was soon aware of his presence. But instead of making the daily library trek, he often just stayed in his room, reading, writing, and thinking of the poems that would one day establish his place in American literary history.
Well, the first year in graduate school, I managed to totter through finally. The second year, however, I fell into pieces. I was sick with disgust and impatience. I would go to the library, and instead of taking notes, I would read Emerson or a book on anthropology, which I sometimes romantically feel should really have been my true love, for the sense of time is always on me.
But let no one suppose that Hyam turned aside because Yale was too much for him. On the contrary, he simply responded to another voice that would guide him to a distinction all his own.
If an angel of the Lord had come to me now and offered me 10,000 years in paradise in the most pleasant and enjoyable setting, providing that I admitted my mistake in the attitude I adopted toward the mechanics of scholarship, I should tell him to go to hell. The decisions of a certain period of one's life cannot justly be called wrong from the vantage point of after years, For each decision is based on the experience which preceded it, not those that are yet to come.
He was very patriotic. He never winced at, at the possibility of being drafted. They knew that they had to serve the country, and especially in World War II. So nobody was going, Hyam missed the excitement about the Vietnam War, but I'm sure he would have objected to that, but not World War II. We moved many times during the war, and I served with Hyam in this country, and then he went overseas. He was in England mostly. David was in the war as well. Did he tell you that?
All 4 sons in the...
Well, 3 sons and a son-in-law.
3 sons and a son-in-law at war.
Bomber base. That's what I had, where I was working when I was in the Army over in Italy. I was on a bomber base. And I guess he was over there somewhere too, in England, wasn't he? This one, the old war. No one cared for the iron sparrow that fell from the sky that quiet day, with no bird's voice, a mad beast's bellow. Sparrow, your wing was a broken scar as you blundered into the mother barley. Sparrow, how many men did you bear?
How many men did you bear? 10 good men, pilot and gunner, trapped in the whirlpool, held by no hands, twisting from truth with curse and prayer. 10 good men I bore in my belly, not as the mother barley bears. 10 good men I returned to her there.
Thunder rolling over the barley, fire swarming high and higher. Home again to the barley mother, 10 good sons, pilot and gunner, radio man and bombardier. Well, that's a poem about one of those big airplanes cracking up with all of its members, all of its crew members. They had a pilot, a co-pilot, a navigator, and a bombardier. They were all officers. And then they had 6 enlisted men who were gunners and armorers and mechanics and so on. So when one of those big guys went down, it meant the loss of, usually meant anyway, the loss of 10 men.
Didn't have any children until we settled here in Rochester. And Roberta was the first arrival.
When my parents moved to Rochester, they first lived near downtown, I believe. It was before I was born, maybe just when I was born. And then we eventually moved to University Park, which was a garden apartment community about a quarter mile from campus, where there was an international community of young professors and graduate students.
Hyam was the first Jewish professor in the English department. They never had a Jew, the U of R. Now half the university is Jewish. But Hyam was number 1.
I don't think, apart from Plutzik, I had a single Jewish professor in my entire academic career there. And indeed, one of my professors, John Christopher, a very nice man in the history department, who saw that I aspired to an academic career, advised me not to do it. And I said, why? He said, well, you know, they don't hire Jews. And sure enough, the history department had no Jews, English department, apart from Plutzik. I won't say it was a hostile environment. I never experienced any hostility, quite the contrary. But it was a very waspy environment.
I was not willing to discuss politics with anybody in that department because I would have been immediately thrown out. It was very conservative, a conservative Eastern University.
In the classroom, he was terribly serious. You never got to know him as a person. He was rather aloof. I thought he seemed troubled. There was something intense about him. Intense and yet withdrawn. He had a way of taking students seriously, as though we were budding literary critics ourselves when we were doing an analysis of a poem. It was a sense of almost being peers, which in a way flattering, but it's very encouraging.
I guess a lot of people who think of professors think of them as always being cerebral and always being academic, but my dad did enjoy fishing a lot, and I was the oldest, and so I was the one, I would say probably most of the time, who went fishing with him when he wasn't going with colleagues. That's a fabulous memory I have. It came across in his poems, of course.
I said that fishing and poetry were two of the most important philosophical occupations, and to conclude, then I'll recite a poem about fishing. The Last Fisherman. He will set his camp beside a cold lake, and when the great fish leap to his lure, shout high to 3 crows battling a northern wind. Now, when the barren twilight closes its circle, we'll fear the yearning ghosts come for his catch, and watch intently trees move in the dark. Fear as the last fire cringes and sputters, heap the branches, strike the reluctant ashes, lie down restless, rise when the dawn grays. Time runs out as the hook lashes the water day after day, and as the days wane, wait still for the wonder.
Well, this is Hyam Plutzik's pipe, isn't it? You know, this is the pipe, you know, and this is some fly fishing reel. Looking at the fly fishing and the pipe, I see him kind of being leisurely by a beachside and kind of taking things in, but that isn't what was happening. You know, what I see in the letters, I know him through the letters, and I know him as a man who taught all year and often taught in the summer to make ends meet. As often, you know, writing, it seemed there were very hard times in the Plutzik family and raising 4 kids, and you know, don't want to give the impression that he sat back with a pipe and fly fished, and that he was able to enjoy those activities says something about his propensity to find those quiet moments of reflection which are necessary for an artist.
Well, nobody ever said that a poet's life was supposed to be easy. It's not. Poets are supposed to do hard work, and the work is part of their lives, and it becomes part of their writing too. I wrote a lot in most of my poems about my work, one way or another. as long as you're not pushing a pencil for somebody else, you're all right. You want a job where you work with your hands and your back and out in the world, out in the forest or the fields. That's the kind of thing that is most conducive to writing good poetry, I think.
One of the things that I found inspiring about Plutzik as a young poet was to see how hard it was to establish himself as a poet in the 40s and 50s. Think what he didn't have. He didn't have very many little magazines. He didn't have reading series, which is a great way to promote yourself. He didn't have very many small presses to get started with. He didn't have various prizes and fellowships, no NEA, anything like that. And you know, for him to persist as he did says a lot about not just his talent, but his perseverance.
If I remember correctly, we agreed that it was a little funny being artists at a university setting. But that was probably the extent of our conversation, acknowledging how each of us in our own way were in this slightly outside role among the academic community.
Now, Hyam, I don't know, you see, I don't know about Hyam's politics at all. I don't remember ever having a discussion about politics with Hyam. He was a poet, an aesthete, as it were. And, but I have a feeling that he was sometimes, I thought, forced to conform to a world that maybe he wasn't any more comfortable in than I was in. I'll put it that way. I'm not sure.
Well, when I think about politics as I was growing up and my parents' interest in politics, I know that we were different from a lot of our neighbors and friends. Upstate New York was a bastion of republicanism. And some of my earliest memories were watching the Army McCarthy hearings and having my parents so concerned about artists that they might not have known but they identified with. It was significant to me, and I was just basically about a kindergartner at the time, but I remember it clearly.
Well, he talked about, for instance, the atomic bomb, and he said, the poet should bring the ultimate meaning to that, not the scientists, not the politicians, but there should be an explanation of what this can do on almost a theoretical level. The danger, the destruction. So he felt that his poetry was relevant to society.
When I say to this average specimen of our mid-century, a poison bolus out of the sky has blasted your wife and children. Your house is dead in this mid-century. He shrugs, staring. You'd expect him to scream, but no, he shrugs, staring. And your brothers and sisters are thrown in the dirty ditch. Your dog and cat in this mid-century are tiger and wolf. And silently moves away. Yet note, when a fly brushes the cheek of this other in this mid-century, he screams.
He did not shy away from the unpleasant subjects. And at one of the temples in town, he had the set topic, anti-Semitism in Pound, Eliot, and Cummings, about which I knew nothing. But I worked it up and I found all sorts of instances and all sorts of attitudes to be taken toward it.
It was conventional anti-Semitism, not in Pound at the time when he was making the broadcasts, but in Eliot it was, and I think Eliot came to regret it very much. It was casual, a casual racial superiority and sneer.
In the 50s, we were upset about T.S. Eliot writing anti-Semitic lines. And Hyam Plutzik wrote a poem to T.S. Eliot for T.S.E. only.
You called me a name on such and such a day. Do you remember? You were speaking of Bleistein, our brother. the barbarian with a black cigar and the pockets ringing with cash.
But at the end, he goes on to say, our brother Bleistein, the Jew whom T.S. Eliot mocked, at the end he calls him my brother, T.S. Eliot.
Thomas, Thomas, come, let us pray together for our exile. You, hypocrite lecteur, mon semblable, mon frère.
They understood each other, he felt. They were both poets, in spite of the fact that T.S. Eliot had written lines that were against Jews. And let us weep together, he says. Let us weep together for our exile. He had an understanding, or tried to have an understanding, of other poets, of other deep thinkers.
Louis Untermeyer came to Rochester, and he was the chairman of the Pulitzer Prize committee that was considering the books of poems that year. That was in late '61, and he called me on the phone, and he said that he wanted to meet with Hyam to tell him Hyam was very, very ill. So he met with me. We had coffee. And he said, I want you to know that there are 5 books now being considered for the Pulitzer Prize. And Hyam is one of them.
It is 60 years since the Prince Hamlet died in the fateful duel, touched by the poisoned rapier, with Claudius the king and the wretched woman. And I, finding no sleep that night in my chamber, went out on the platform where the guard stood, Bernardo, my friend, staring down at the city.
Horatio can never tell the story aright. Hamlet says to him, tell my story aright. And of course Horatio can't tell it aright any more than I can tell the story of Hyam Plutzik aright. I think it's ironic that we're going through the same, by analogy, procedure here that he went through with Horatio in his poem, to tell the story aright. Ah, Hamlet, to think that I have allowed millions of words to roost in my skull, like bats in an old cavern, yet found no garden to shelter the light-winged ones against the winds of hours, seasons, and years. It's magnificent stuff.
Horatio was full of experiential irony. You know, that's the whole story of Horatio's career. In Shakespeare, remember, he says, he promises to his friend that, or he accepts the challenge from Hamlet that in this harsh world he will draw his breath to tell Hamlet's story, even if it's in pain, and he readily accepts that. That's the least he can do and the most he can do for his friend. And over how many years, 50 years, he tries to do that, only to find that what he thinks is the truth of Hamlet's story, it gets away from him.
But, he blurted, you persist in talking of truth. Your devotions for truth's sake. What, pray, is truth? What is this truth you would exhume from the grave? Truth to me is what I can see, a fact, no more or less.
I think some of the images that Hyam used may have been metaphors for Hamlet. The last lines in Horatio are, a great stag came out of the woods and looked about him like a king and re-entered the dark. And since I scarcely knew Hyam, you know, he appeared and disappeared. So I could think of him in those terms. Not that there was anything proud or you know, self-presentational about him, but he did a major work and then he vanished.
sprig of lilac. Their heads grown weary under the weight of time, these few hours on the hither side of silence, the lilac sprigs bend on the bough to perish. Though each for its own sake is beautiful, in each is the greater, the remembered beauty.
Each is exemplar of its ancestors within the flower of the present, uneasy in the wind, are the forms of those of the years behind the door.
And the living and the past give to one another. There is no door between them. They pass freely out of themselves, becoming one another. I see the lilac sprigs bending and withering. Each year, like Adonis, they pass through the dumb show of death, waxing and waning on the tree in the brain of man.
Waxing and waning on the tree in the brain of a man. From a very early age, I loved language. I loved the sound of words. And I still think of it as very much a part of my selfhood, insofar as it speaks to me of the meaning of the life itself.
If Stanley Kunitz had died at 52, he would be totally unknown, because everything for which we love him and admire him and regard him as a great poet was written in the last part of his life. So he was still going to school. He wrote a lot of poems, but he didn't know it, of course, but they were preparing him for his great late poems. And same thing might have been true with Hyam.
I don't know, it almost seemed to be a foreboding that he would die young, though it never occurred to any of us that he would, but somehow this great feeling for the motion of the world, for the depths of life, seemed to be something that was too much to bear.
Sort of in the autumn, or maybe later autumn of 1961, I remember my mother telling us, "Your father is ill," and then her saying he was very ill, and then she would say desperately ill.
Melanoma. Actually, he survived 5 years after the first surgery. And then it reappeared and spread.
Here, in the fisherman casting on the water, he saw the end of the dreamer, and in that image, death, naked. Out of my life, I fashioned a fistful of words. When I opened my hand, they flew away.
I consider myself a married woman with Hyam no matter where I go. I'm a lucky one to have found the right person. And I'm content. Okay, girls and boys. So what can I tell you about this? This is Hyam's study, where he came down whenever he had an inclination to write a poem. He was separated from the family and had the privacy that he needed to think and write. Yeah, and of course this is something that Hyam didn't live to see. It happened a year later. How do I feel about this room? Well, it's a great place where Hyam was, but it, of course, has lost its original significance because he's not here. But I'm happy you think it's significant. So here it is. Okay. I'm done. How about you? Are you done? I'm done.
But feel the brush of the wind on the face, the bath of the light, the torment of beauty deep in the throat, and strive in secret, this brotherhood so small, to climb the stairway out of the dust a moment before the lying down to sleep and surrender.